Printers, Part 2. In this nugget, we talk about printers. This will be part 2, where we'll continue our discussion by talking about printer connections. How do you actually connect that printer to the computer? Is it through a Bluetooth? Is it through a Wi-Fi, a network, or a direct connection using USB or something? A lot of different ways of making that connection, and we'll also talk about performing the actual installation of those printers. Then we'll talk also about how to share the printers, especially in a small office or any kind of a business environment. You'll want to share the printers so that other people can use that same one, and not everybody has to have their own individual printer. Alright, let's talk here about the various types of connections that can be made to a printer. One of the first ones, this is kind of, outdated now and archaic, but is the infrared. Now this is kind of something that is a little bit inconvenient because, as with all infrared signals, it depends on direct line of sight. It's not obstructed by anything. So you could send a print job through an infrared signal, and this infrared is the same kind of infrared that's used for your television remote control and the like. And if someone were to walk in front of the computer at the time it's trying to send a print job to the printer, it would interrupt that print job. So it was highly annoying at times, and I don't think you're going to see a lot of that, but I leave it on the list because it is still a somewhat of a possibility. There's also some possibility of serial printer connections. Now the reason why I leave that on there as well is because you're not going to probably see that in most companies or in users' homes, but you will likely see it in retail environments because especially a lot of those retail environments that use dot matrix printers, they're very often still connected by the old 9-pin serial connection. I mean, the dot matrix printers are old, the connections are old, the cash registers or whatever it is that they're connected to, they're all old, but they still use them, and so if it's not broken, don't fix it, right? So very often you'll still see those serial types of connections. And if, in terms of troubleshooting, by the way, either one of these things, with infrared, mostly it's going to be line of sight or distance. You can't get very far away with those things. I mean, the spec calls for about 12 feet. I've been able to get them go further than that, but they're supposed to be reliable up to about 12 feet. And then serial, another reason why you might see those is because you can use a pretty long cable on those that extends farther than some of the other types of cabled connections. I think those go to about 50 feet as a maximum for the serial cable. So, but regardless, even if you do see these serial connections, like I mentioned earlier in older cash registers and things like that, they're usually pretty close. There's also parallel ports. You might still see these. A lot of the printers up to just a few years ago still had parallel ports on the back of them. I don't think anything new was going to have parallel ports, though. They're going to probably be USB FireWire or possibly a network connection. Some of them are also wireless, as in Wi-Fi wireless. And then there's also SCSI connections. Again, this is somewhat, archaic. I'm kind of going from least common down to the most common as we get down to the bottom few down here at the bottom. But SCSI, again, that's kind of obscure because most people, at least home users, don't really understand SCSI, don't know how to use SCSI, don't know how to terminate devices and all those things that they would have to know otherwise. Remember, if you don't properly terminate a SCSI chain, then none of the devices on there will be recognizable. So you have to properly terminate it to recognize any of the devices. And then, so you'll see that sometimes in more high-end printing solutions, again, probably in a corporate environment. There's also Bluetooth, which is kind of, it was novel at the first, but it also has a limited range, and so it's not likely to be used in many cases because of that. But its advantage over something like IR is simply that you don't have to have line of sight, and you don't have to worry about something blocking the signal and things of this nature. Now you're starting to get into the more common ones, and these are going to be more popular or more frequently seen in different environments. So these are really in no particular order. So here we can start off with, for example, a Wi-Fi connection. Now I know I have Wi-Fi here and network here. They're both actually network. It's just that Wi-Fi here is wireless on the network, and this one down here is going to be more like an Ethernet connection. Ethernet. Where you can get 10 megabits per second, 100 megabits per second, or maybe a gigabit E. You could get any one of those, but they're both network, and both of these will have an IP address as well. The advantage for using Wi-Fi, let me get back to that one, is that of course you don't have to have any cables going to it. I mean, it's hard enough to string as many cables as we've got to all of our different USB devices and so forth. Plus, I can put it clear in a different room without having to worry about connecting, or without worrying about a long enough USB cable or any of those sorts of things. So the convenience kind of speaks for itself in that respect. Also, if it's Wi-Fi, and again, Wi-Fi or an Ethernet connected device, then I can make it available to all the users on the network, and it's not like it's a shared from a specific server or workstation, but if that workstation is turned off, nobody can print to it. I'll talk more about sharing here in a moment. Whereas if it's on a Wi-Fi network where it's got its own IP address, or a Ethernet network where again it's got its own IP address, anybody can print to it at any time regardless of whether or not other computers are turned on the network. So those are, I'm kind of covering those both in one fell swoop here, so to speak. But then, of course, there's also USB. This is what you're most likely to see. If you see it in a company, it's probably going to be a printer that's dedicated to a single user. Maybe it's an executive that has their own, laser printer, so they don't have to stretch their legs and go into the common printer room where all of the unwashed masses go to pick up their print job. No, they've got their own laser printer in their own office that they don't have to share with anybody. And then there's also the USB connection that you're likely to see in home environments or small office environments as well. The advantage of that, of course, is simply going to be that users don't normally have to know anything about networking or how to assign IP addresses to their printers and all this sorts of things. So for user purposes and home office users, it's going to be a pretty good solution. And then just a quick note here as well, if you have a network-connected printer via Wi-Fi or Ethernet, then very often they will have HTML content embedded into that printer so that you can administer it remotely using an IP address. So that's kind of handy as well because you don't have to be right at the printer to manage it. You could manage this from any place on the same network. So pretty cool that way. Also, it usually will give you a pretty up-to-date list of what's going on with it. For example, it says right now that it's in sleep mode. This is actually the printer behind me. Let me turn it off sleep mode, and then as the screen refreshes here, we see that it's now ready for everything. So that's just one example of those sorts of things. I think I got another printer on the network here available right now too. Yeah, that's my Epson 4880. As you can see here, and it also shows its IP address further on down here and stuff like that. And I can, of course, fully administer this one as well over an IP address. Now, let's go ahead and take a look next here at some installation items. And one of the first things you want to look at here with installation is that you, generally speaking nowadays, especially with USB printers, want to install the drivers and the software first. Now, plug and play was supposed to be so fancy that you would just plug it in using a USB cable or FireWire or something, and plug and play, the advertisements would always tell you that it should just be able to pick it up and automatically install the correct drivers and everything. But as it turns out, with printers, that's usually not the way that works, because it will be able to detect the device, but very often it will just use drivers out of its local store of drivers that are supplied by Microsoft, which might be outdated. Now, Microsoft can go to Windows Update to also get the latest drivers for you. However, they may not be quite as functional as the ones that come on the CD or that you download from the manufacturer's website. Also, these drivers may interoperate with certain software, especially for multifunction, multifunction devices. So if you were just to use Microsoft's drivers or let plug and play detect and install drivers on its own, you might get basic print functionality out of a multifunction device, but how would you use the scanner? Well, very often that requires certain software that comes on the CD from the manufacturer. So that's one of those things to think about. How would you convert something to a PDF? Would it give you all of the additional functions, such as duplexing, for example? Or if it's a color multifunction, will the out-of-the-box driver that comes from Microsoft only do monochrome? So you see, there's a lot of different things there that will be to your advantage if you install the CD or the downloaded web version of the drivers and the software from the manufacturer first, and do not plug the device in first. Do all of this first. Then when and very often it'll tell you in the wizard, during the installation process, it'll say plug in your printer now, and then you'll plug in the USB port. So as an example, I'm just going to plug in my Epson R1800 printer here in a moment, but I'm not going to do that quite yet because I'm going to follow my own advice and go to the computer, and I'm going to access the CD or the DVD that came with this printer. Then I'm going to just go through the little wizard and everything. Of course, we're using Windows here. We'll talk about user account control more with Windows later on. But this just allows it to run so that I can make that administrative decision, and it helps to prevent unexpected software from running that could be malicious. Then what we'll do is just go ahead and click Install to install the drivers in the reference guide, and that's kind of their help system and all of that stuff. So we'll let that do its thing. And I don't think I'm going to be extremely elaborate on every step of this. If there's something of note that you would need to know regardless of the brand of software or the brand of printer you were installing, I'll pause there. But otherwise, I'm going to kind of next finish through this because it's otherwise vendor specific. Alright then, now that printer has installed, and it was actually pretty simple. There was a little space there, a little spot there where it asked me to plug in the printer, and I went ahead and did so through the USB cable. That was pretty much it. No, not too painful at all. Then if I go to printer, or the control panel here, notice that there's a printer link down here that I can now access. And then I will go up here and I'll see that the R1800 is installed. And notice that it also sets itself up as the default printer. This is actually an annoyance that I have. This is a somewhat high-end. It's a higher level than a consumer level photo printer, but it makes itself the default. Now I don't want my kids printing out their homework on this thing because it's going to be more expensive. I'd rather they printed it out on this thing. So you may have to go back to one of your other printers after an installation, if you've got more than one, and right-click to set that one as the default printer. And now you can see that this one is the default instead. Okay. So anyway, otherwise, that's pretty much it. We now have this device installed. The other thing I would recommend that you do, this is also true of troubleshooting scenarios, is that you should go to the properties of this and print a test page. Just put a piece of cheap paper in there. Doesn't have to be fancy photo paper in this case. Print a test page, and the reason why you want to do that is because if it comes out successfully, that will identify that there's good communication going on between the operating system and the physical link, which would be the USB cable in this case, and the printer itself. And then later on, if you have troubles with this, then you can already know that it's not any of those things that I just mentioned that's causing the problem. It could be the application, or if it's a photo printer, it could be a color profile, or some other thing that's causing a problem, but you know that the basic connections and everything that goes on between the operating system and printer are just fine. Alright, so I went ahead and printed out that Windows test page, and then I went to my other printer, my Canon multifunction one, and I created a scan of that page using Adobe Acrobat Pro, as you can see here, and then this is what the test page looks like. So it just tells me that I got a successful print out of it. I don't want to see any garbage or anything like that. If I see strange characters and odd looking things or partially completed pages, could be a problem either with the connection or with, more likely, the incorrect driver having been used. So this is my test page, and it just gives me, again, the rudimentary information, including the drivers that are all used by this particular printer. For example, the driver version that we see right there. Okay? And that might be useful if you identify that there's actually a more up-to-date driver that you can use instead. And then returning to our little whiteboard here, also and this is very often something you can do while you're installing the drivers and from the CD and everything, check the shipping tape on the printer. A lot of times they have tape that closes doors and holds them shut, or holds the heads in place if it's an inkjet printer. Things like this that make it more stable for transport so that something doesn't get damaged in transport. There may also be little styrofoam blocks and things inside of there. There's also usually a quick setup guide of some type that will show you exactly where all of those things are, so you don't leave something out. And you certainly wouldn't want to turn on that device with something in place that could cause it to put stress on it. If there's tape holding back the head or something like that, you wouldn't want to damage it. So make sure you remove all of that. I talked to you already pretty much about the USB plug and play. It actually works very, very well, but again, I can't emphasize this part of it enough. Drivers and software first. For TCP/IP installation, let's go ahead and take a look at how to do that one. This is going to require a little bit more technical knowledge, and most home users won't know how to do this. Now here I'm going to install a TCP/IP printer, and again I'm going to start with the CD-ROM that came with it. This is actually the Canon multifunction printer that I've got behind me here. And I'll double-click on this. This is connected via a 100 megabit per second Ethernet network, and I think its IP address is 10.10.10.3. Anyway, I'm going to choose a custom installation here so that we can specify that we're connecting to not something that's directly connected to the printer by USB, but a network. Okay, and so I'll choose that option, and then I'll choose Next. Then what I want to do is I want to make sure that it does install the drivers, and I'll go ahead and install those. Again, I'm not going to elaborate too much on this. I'm accepting the license agreement, of course. But since this is vendor-specific, I won't really identify too much about this unless we get to something that would be common to all types of TCP/IP printer installations. Oh, here's an item that might be interesting. Notice that it tells me that the Windows firewall is set up right now, and it could block the program, and it asks me if I want to unblock it. Now, I'll normally say yes to this, and that will open up ports available so that the computer can communicate with that printer. And these would be ports that would otherwise be blocked. Now, it's likely that the application needs those ports unblocked so that it's able to communicate. I'm going to click on yes for that. This also is something we'll talk a little bit more about when we talk about networking in a future nugget. But here it's identified that printer. It's just the software kind of scans for any potential printers that might be the one that it's looking for here, and it found this one. If it didn't find it, I could search by IP address and manually enter in the IP address if I was pretty sure I knew it, or I could update the device list so that it would scan again. This is also a printer and a fax machine, so I might choose fax as well here. And then I can give the printer a name. Now, generally speaking, this is automatically filled in by the vendor, but you might want to give something more useful for your purposes there. For example, you might want to say printer in, Office 5, or printer on second floor, or whatever else. You can also use this as a shared printer, and if I choose this option, that would make it available for other people to be able to share, and then I would also give it a shared name. Now, here's where it's not really all that convenient. This is where you definitely want to be user-friendly, because if it's going to be shared, that means other people are going to use it and look for it on the network. So you want to make it something that people can easily identify. Okay, so I might say Canon in James' office. Okay, all right, so I might do something like that. I can also choose drivers to add, so that if I wanted to provide support for 64-bit printing as well. Right now, the operating system we're looking at right now, actually, I'm not quite sure. I can't remember. Let me go to the properties of this computer. Okay, it's a 32-bit operating system. So what this is telling me is only clients with a 32-bit operating system would be able to use the same drivers I'm about to install. So if I choose additional drivers here, then it would also allow 64-bit clients to use this shared printer, and it will automatically detect whether they're 32 or 64-bit operating systems. Okay, because they have to have the respective number of bits for a proper installation. So I'll just go ahead and click on next. Also use it as a shared fax, and once again, I can say, fax, Canon fax in James' office. Something like that. Drivers to add. Once again, I'm going to add the 64-bit drivers like I did for the printer, and then I'll click on install, and we'll let the thing do its job. Now, I want to point out also that since I've made this a shared printer, if people print to this printer through my computer, they're actually going to be looking for my computer on the network, and my computer will advertise this printer as a shared printer. This means that my computer must be constantly on in order for other people to be able to access. This would be a bad idea if this were a laptop and I were in and out of the office all the day, making sales calls or traveling or whatever else. Then anytime someone tried to print to it, it would be missing, and they would get error messages, and people would get frustrated. So I would recommend that much of the time for a TCP/IP connected printer, that you don't actually share it like I just did. I just did that kind of for drill and to show you how to do it. But I would recommend that for something that has its own IP address on the network, that you share, allow people to use the same CD. Just give it to them, let them install it the same exact way, and that way they'll have their own dedicated connection to that TCP/IP address, rather than depending upon my computer to be on and available at all times. Now, I do like this particular manufacturer because they allow me to select the default printer rather than forcing me into using something else. I do want to use this one as the default. Actually, I just realized that one's not even on the network anymore. That one's gone. That one I got rid of. So anyway, yeah, now I'm ready to go ahead and move along. This does also allow me to print a test page with this utility rather than having to go into the printer properties thereafter. And so now that's pretty much it. When I go ahead and click next, I'm ready to exit. With this one, I do have to restart the computer, so I'll do that and then we'll come back. Alright, then as I rebooted the computer and came back to Control Panel, we see that there's my default printer now, this Canon multifunction printer. We know that it's shared also because it's got the little, symbol. I don't know if we can see it, it's kind of small. Kind of little symbol there of some humanoids on there, as opposed to, I don't know, space aliens. Anyway, we also see that the green checkbox is there, indicating that this is the default printer. Now, if I wanted to add an additional TCP/IP printer, I could do that. There's another method for doing this. I can right-click here, choose Add Printer, and then I could go into this and choose Add Network, Wireless, or Bluetooth Printer. Okay, they all have to be on or on the network or available. Then I could also choose local, but I'm going to choose the network one. This is just another way of doing the same thing. Here we see that I've got the the Canon printer. It's shared on Vista Client 01, which is actually the same computer that I'm on right now. So that would be sharing to myself. That'd be kind of redundant, so I don't want to do that one. This is also, that's the fax. This is also the printer that I could do. Here it identifies this same one that, again, I just installed by IP address. Okay, the same one there for the fax. And then here we've got the one I would be interested in. In this case, it identifies the IP address. Now, very often, I don't know, I seem to have gotten lucky this time. Very often, they don't actually show up here, and you have to choose the printer that I want isn't listed. Then you would have to add the printer using its TCP IP address or host name. What's host name? This is something that it will appear in Domain Naming Services, or DNS. This is a little bit beyond our scope for the time being, but we'll talk more about it when we discuss networking at a later time. But I would just choose TCP IP here if I needed to and click on Next, and then I would enter in the IP address for it. And in my case, I'm just going to go ahead and add it the way I was going to do earlier, because it did seem to be able to detect it pretty easily here. I'm going to select on the .4 printer and click on Next. And then what it will do is it says, hey, we're not really sure which printer this is. So name the printer. Well, it happens to be an Epson. But as I go on down through this, I'm going to find out that the only Epson printers that are available there, as is very often the case, is not the actual printer that's attached. These are some of those LQ printers. Those are letter quality printers. Those are dot matrix. So those are kind of old, but they're still available here. Anyway, it's not in this list. The highest level printer it would go to would be this R320, which I used to have, but I don't have anymore. So I'd have to click Have Disk. Then it would browse for the location on my computer where I've put in the CD. That's on drive D here. And you'll just go into this. And then I would go into where the drivers are located. And where would that be? That would be Windows Vista right here. Not the 64-bit ones, but it would be the 32-bit ones. So then I would choose Open and OK. And then it would identify the correct printer. Notice that it also has a little, kind of a little symbol of a certificate over there. What's that mean? That means that it has a signature on it. This means that a digital certificate has been used to validate that this is indeed the unchanged drivers from the manufacturer, and that helps to ensure a level of quality control. Because if they're signed at drivers, very, very little chance that they'll cause the computer to crash. So you want to try to choose that if you possibly can. Again, I don't want to choose this one as the default printer. I'm just going to use that occasionally to print photographs maybe. So then I would just click on Next and it would install the printer. It's pulling the, I can look at the optical media, the DVD drive right now. The light's flashing and it's reading all the drivers off of there and performing the installation. Sometimes during the installation, by the way, you might see this message pop up. Just identifying that it's got device driver software. It asks if I want to install it or not. I'll go ahead and choose to install. And then as usual, I went ahead and sent a test page as well, and it printed out just fine. So now we're finished, and we can see the printer now appears. Next time I need to take a look at updating the drivers. What if I ran into a problem where there was an incompatibility with the applications I was using, didn't seem to like the driver or something? Well, Epson may have come out with an update or something to make that more compatible. So what I would do is I'd go to Epson's website, which I've already done, and I would download the latest package of drivers. Now I actually don't know if this solves any problems or not. I'm not really experiencing any problems with this. But what I could do with this then is I could double click on it, and if the vendor has made it this way, then in this case it's a self-extracting archive, which unzips it into the directory that you see right here. So I could just run unzip, and then it would launch itself once I clicked OK here, and you can see that right here. I'm actually going to cancel that because although that would be the most convenient way of doing this, it may also be that you don't have a utility that does that for you like Epson makes available. And I may have to manually update the driver, and I'll show you how to do that. Alright, so then in order to do this kind of the Windows way without any assistance from the utility from the printer manufacturer, I would go into wherever the printer is right here, and I would go to its properties. And then I would go into, where is it? I just blanked. Oh, the Advanced tab. You'd go over here to the Advanced tab, and then you would choose New Driver. Now, notice that in this case, it's grayed out. This is because I'm working with Windows Vista, and it doesn't allow me to do that as a common user. So I'd have to run this as an administrator, and then go to its properties, and click on Continue. And that's, again, user account control, which we'll address a little bit more detail later on. Now I can update the driver, and the reason why I couldn't do it before is because it didn't recognize me as an administrator, someone with full control over the computer. So I'll go ahead and click on Next in this case, and then I would choose Have Disk. It's not really on a disk or a CD. It's on a network path, or a local file path, so I'm going to go to my C drive, to the Epson directory. This is where, remember, it extracted everything. Then I'll double click here, and what it's really doing is it's looking for an INF file. An INF is an information file, and that would be this text file right here. And if we right click on this, and I'm just going to open it with Notepad, I think, here, real quick here. then what it's going to do is it's going to identify all the characteristics about the driver, where the paths are, what it's used for, all the different files that are involved. You don't need to memorize or even be able to identify a lot of this different stuff, but that just gives you some characteristics about it, about the updating of that driver that's going to need to take place. So I'll click OK here for everything, and I'm just kind of quickly going through this because I'm sure you guys know how to click on Next and Finish and OK. But you just follow the instructions pretty much, and when I click on Finish, it should then update that printer driver. Some devices you'll also need to update the firmware for at various times. This is because the device manufacturer kind of leaves the design and the programming of that device somewhat open-ended, so that they can update the firmware to add additional features, fix bugs, those sorts of things. It's kind of like a patch for your computer, only in this case it's more of a patch or an update for your hardware instead. So here I've just jumped over to Epson's webpage. I've browsed to the correct location for all of their updates. Here's the firmware update. Now there's a problem with this as well. When you get a firmware update, how do you actually apply it to that device? Because it's not like you do an update that you do in your operating system where you use Windows Update or you click Next, Finish or whatever. How do I actually get this on there? Well, sometimes it can take place through a separate configuration utility. Sometimes there's a web page that you can access from the device that you also do this with. Usually you just have to find the instructions in here to get this. I think this one uses a utility of some kind. But I'm just going to go ahead and download this for the time being. And accept this, and then you'll see here that it'll pop open here in a moment asking me to accept the download. I'll go ahead and choose to download this, and then I'll save it to my desktop for the time being. And then as it does that, I'm going to go back to where we were before. Sure enough, here it says to apply the firmware update, use the Remote Panel 2 utility, also downloadable from this page. Looks like it is. I guess this is the only one that looks like. So I'll go ahead and download this item as well. And once that happens, then I'll go ahead and extract the files and use the utility and the update files to update the device. So let me just go ahead and download this one quickly as well. So now I've got my download in place. This is actually an old file, so let me delete that one so it doesn't get confusing here. This is the firmware update itself. This is the utility. So I'm going to go ahead and double-click on the firmware update to extract it, and you can see that it extracts it to this following location. That's okay with me. I'm just going to unzip all of that and click OK. Once that's been done, then I'll go to the utility that actually can perform the update, and I'll go ahead and unzip this thing here as well. It doesn't really matter the paths and all of that. I'm just pointing out that we use this utility in this particular vendor. Again, each vendor may be different, so I'm not going to be too specific about all these different things. We're just going to quickly kind of go next, finish in this case. Alright, everything installed okay. Now all I need to do is to choose the firmware updater here. And then it asks me to, actually I'm pulling that off screen here. So then it says select a printer. There's my printer. Then I'm going to browse for the appropriate file. Again, that's going to be on my C drive under the Epson directory that I mentioned earlier. There's the firmware file as I kind of skip ahead here. And then we're just going to go ahead and choose to update this. This shows me the current firmware version of the printer and the newer firmware version of the printer. Again, you don't need to memorize all the steps that I used to get here. You just use whatever utility your particular vendor uses in order to get the update applied. And again, if you don't already have that in your documentation, their website should give you some enlightenment on that. Then when it's done, it'll just tell you that the update is complete. Pretty easy. There's not a whole lot else to that in this case. But basically, in short, you sometimes need to update that firmware. Let's talk about sharing printers. Now, we started to talk about that a little bit earlier, but we needed to complete some of our other discussions, such as updating the drivers and the firmware and stuff. But now that we've got our printer ready and out there, how do we share it with other people? Well, first of all, let's talk about some of the advantages of sharing a printer with others. Here, if I've got, let's just say, a network, and this circle represents my network, and I've got, a user that sits at a desktop over here, and a user that sits at a desktop over here. Okay, you're supposed to be desktop computers. Maybe somebody over here as well, okay? Actually, that's going to be upside down, isn't it? So let's try another one. We got a desktop over here. And I've got a printer attached to this one. Okay, and it's got a page coming out of it. There's print jobs coming out of here. But these other people, these poor people over here, are always complaining, hey, how come Phil down here gets his own printer and we don't get nothing? Bad English, I know. We don't get anything. How about that? Well, what we can do with that is to help bring peace to the office by sharing out this printer to other people. We can do it by user or by groups, and we can use certain permissions as we need to. But this user's printer that's connected, in this case, let's say it's by a USB port, will be able to be available for these other users now. So when they're connected to the network, they will connect to the network and they will see this user's computer, and they will see that this computer has advertised this printer as a share, and then either one or both of these will be able to print to that same printer. But once again, if this computer down here, maybe it's actually a laptop, and this person's out of the office, well, they can't connect to the computer because it's out of the office, therefore they can't access the printer either. It might just be sitting on the desktop doing nothing. So another kind of a shared printer that we could use would be a TCP/IP printer, which is the kind that I've been working with here lately, and it might have an IP address of 10.10.10.4, and then these people up here could print to this printer whether or not this user is in the office. It's not computer dependent. Let me show you one other scenario that could occur as well, and that might be I would have a server, and maybe the server has a USB connection to this printer instead of this guy over here. Let's ignore this person. And so the server now is normally going to be always on, always available, and in corporate environments, sometimes you will have a print server that manages the print jobs. And the reason for that is because it will handle all the jobs from all the users. And there might be dozens or even hundreds of users printing through this print server to this printer down here. So in corporate environments or larger environments, you're better off to use a print server like we have here, or an IP printer like we have over here. So then how am I going to share this printer? And this is going to be the same if I use a print server like this, or if I were to use this original scenario where I had a user's computer attached to that USB port. Now, the way I would do that in this type of a case where it's attached to a PC is I would share it from the control panel. Let's go ahead and take a look at how that might look. Here I would go into the control panel, and I would access the printer that I was interested in sharing. And here would be the printer. Let's say I want to share this, this really fancy, $2,000 photo printer. Can't imagine why I would want to do that. But anyway, let's just say I do. So I'll click on sharing here. And notice that, again, it has to know that I'm an administrator to be able to do this. That's why this stuff is grayed out. But I can change the sharing options to tell it that I'm an administrator by clicking on continue. At that point, I can click on share the printer, and I'll give it a name. Okay, and I can put something more user-friendly in there if I want to. I can say corporate photo printer, or I can say only for graphic arts department. Whatever makes sense. Sometimes it's going to be the location of it, or something that makes sense to the users. It has to be user-friendly because other people will be using this. So I'll also render the print jobs on client computers. What in the world does that mean? If I clear that checkbox, then all of the processing for interpreting how the printer codes go through the printer driver and then get sent on to the printer, all of those calculations and determinations have to be made on this computer. Well, that could really bog me down if I got lots of other users sending very highly complex or lengthy print jobs. Then my computer is going to slow way down. So instead, I'm going to render the jobs on their client computers. Their computers will perform all that calculation and so forth. Again, I could also choose additional drivers as necessary. I think I'm just going to leave that blank in this case. Then I'll just click OK, and now we'll see that this is a shared printer. So in order to make someone else be able to print to that, let's give it a try. All right, so now to illustrate that, this is actually a different computer. This is another Windows Vista computer, and I'm going to connect that printer here in Control Panel by going to Printers. You see that it's not installed right now. So what I want to do is to add a printer by right-clicking. Then I can choose Add a Network, Wireless, whatever printer. Again, the list shows up. If it does not show up, then what I would have to do is to choose the printer that I want isn't listed. In this case, this is the actual one, so it shows up just fine. If it wasn't listed and I clicked here, then I would have to type this in the dialog box that appears. Okay? Then I'll go ahead and click on Next because I know that's the one I want. And it's going to go ahead and download the drivers, make that printer available, and I'll be able to print to it just fine. I do have to be an administrator to be able to choose Install Driver. That's why it has a little shield icon on there. Only administrators can do this. So I'll just choose Install Driver, and away we go. Other than that, we get kind of the same options we would have had before. I could set it as the default printer. Since really that's the only printer I've got right now, I'm going to leave it at that. Again, always print a test page. That's kind of an A+ mantra. You must print a test page, almost no matter what the circumstance, before you start troubleshooting, after you're done troubleshooting, when you install printers, under almost any circumstance, print a test page. Now, in addition to the fact that I've shared this printer out, I may also want to adjust the permissions of the printer. So as an administrator, I'll go to its properties, and here I would not go to the sharing tab to adjust those permissions. For this, I would go to security, And then notice that everyone has the ability to print. Notice that they can also manage printers or manage the documents. If they manage printers, that means they can do such things such as change the default settings of it. For example, whether the default setting is to print color, black and white, or whether or not to do duplexing if the printer supports it, things like that. And then here's the account that I logged on with. Since I'm the one that is the administrator and I'm the one that installed it, of course I have full permissions all the way across. There's also special permissions that can be applied as well. These don't really apply in our scope, but this gives us the ability to even see things like actually to be able to see the printer at all, like read permissions. So if I wanted to hide it completely from somebody, I might deny the read permissions under special permissions. But in my case, I just want to add an additional user, for example. Let's say this would be temp help 01. I think I have an account. Yeah, there you go. Temp help 01. Maybe now this user is part of everyone. Anybody that is on the computer basically is part of everyone. So this account right here, I didn't really have to add them if I want them to print because they're already part of everyone. But in this case, I added them because maybe I don't want them printing out garage sale flyers on my expensive 4800 printer here. So instead what I'll do is I'll say for that particular user, deny. Because that's the kind of person I am. I'm just that mean. So I'm going to deny this person the ability to print to that printer. And then when they log onto this computer and try to print to it, they just won't be able to. And then on the other hand, I might have another user or set of users that I want to have a higher level of privilege. In order to administer that, I'm going to right-click Computer here and choose Manage. And this is going to show me the users and groups that I can work with. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but we will come back to this at a later point in time. But for the point in time right now, let's just identify that I have this temp help 02 user and the trainer account. Maybe this person is just an expert in this type of printer, and we've got them on site to help us troubleshoot it if we ever have any problems. And I want to add them to the Print Manager security group, which I've already done by clicking the Add button here. Okay, so I've got that group that I want to give a higher level of privilege to this printer. So to do that, I click on Add, just like I did for the earlier user account. And then I want to go to Print Managers, I think is what it was, and press Enter, and there they are. Now I don't want them just to print, I want them to manage printers and to manage documents. And then I click OK, and here we say it's identifying that for this user account we had set deny permissions. That's just telling us that deny overrides any other privileges they have. Because remember, they're also a member of everyone. So they're denied here, they're allowed here. Which one applies? Deny always wins. That's what that's telling us right there. Okay. So now we've been able to customize and adjust the permissions on this particular printer. This is also, by the way, very similar to what you could do with file permissions, such as with NTFS. So now here, notice that I've logged on as temp help 01. This is the person that should be denied access to the printing properties, or to be able to print at all. So I'll go to the printer, and we'll be able to identify nothing. See, it doesn't even show up if I've been denied permission. Now, let's go ahead and try to log on as the other user who has permissions to use this printer and even administer it. Then here you can see that I've logged on as temp help 02. For this user account in Control Panel and Printer, you'll see that I do have the printer visible, and I can make changes to it as well. If I go to Properties, for example, and go to Printing Preferences, that can also reset the defaults. You know, I could do things like that. I could also do things such as go to the Advanced tab and set the printing defaults for all users. So I could click on this item and make this settings up in here, you know, for anybody that were to use this item. So that's a higher level of privilege than your average user, and certainly a higher level of privilege than somebody that's been denied access to the printer entirely. Now then, let me also show you here how I would delete a printer. I can go back to Control Panel once again and go back into Printers. Here I'm logged on as the trainer account, which is an administrative account. And I can right-click on this printer, and I can just choose Delete, or I could have hit the Delete button. Then just click on Yes. Now the drivers are actually still on the computer. So if I wanted to add this back in using a different method, I could do that. And that might be what I might want to do if it's a true network TCP/IP printer. Again, Epson has a utility that does all of that for me, but sometimes you don't always have that. So if we were to assume that we didn't have that luxury, then what I would do is I'd have to know the IP address for that printer, or the host name as well. I'll put host name out here too. Host and name. And that again would be its name in DNS. Then I would also choose to use the standard TCP/IP port. Now, there are different there are different vendors out there, such as HP. Hewlett-Packard has something called a Jet Direct card, which makes printers available on the network. That's just another vendor's method for doing this, and I might use a different type of a TCP/IP port for that because they have different characteristics underlying their TCP/IP port. Or different vendors may have a different kind of a TCP/IP port. But the Windows standard kind of generic one is usually good for most purposes. Again, it'll often have its own web page as well that I might be able to access as well. But for our purposes, I'm simply going to go over here, and now I'm going to choose to add the printer, and I'm going to again choose a network printer. In this case, I'm not going to do the browsing option there. I'm going to choose that it wasn't listed. Now I'll choose the IP address, and I'll choose the IP address right here, which was 10.10.10.4. And then it'll give it a unique port name. Now, I had already had a port of that name before because I've installed this printer before. So when I did that using Epson software, it gave it a port name of this. Okay, so in this case, since it's already in use, I'll have to choose a different one. And I'll choose Next here, and that's fine. Okay. Now, from that point forward, it's mostly the same as any other kind of a printer installation that we would have done. It'll ask me for drivers if it doesn't have them, and then we would continue on through the installation process. In this nugget, we discussed printers. This was part 2, where we started off by talking about printer connections. Remember, there's a number of different ways to make those connections, whether it's Bluetooth, infrared, parallel, serial, but probably the most common are going to be USB or network connections, whether it's through a shared printer on a computer or through a direct TCP/IP connection. We took a look also at the installation, and this involves several steps sometimes. It may involve also a utility from the print manufacturer that helps the installation of the drivers go along very, very smoothly. This is especially important for multifunction printers, which may have additional software utilities and things that interact with those drivers. We also took a look at sharing the printers, and that's very often the case even in small offices or even in home environments like the one I work out of. We want multiple people to use the same printer, so if you share it, then other people don't have to have their own individual printer directly attached to their computers. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.